video, we're going to be looking at Angela Carter's short story, The Company of Wolves, from The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. For my students this year, your POE question involves comparing The Company of Wolves to the original fairy tale. And although that's not the goal of this analysis, I will touch on that, so you should be able to use some of the things I mention as examples in your essay. I'll discuss the context, the characters, themes, motifs, and symbolism, and I'll end off by doing a close reading of some of the imagery in the story. So let's give you a quick recap of the plot. The story begins with a folkloric introduction that describes the dangers of wolves and werewolves. They're cunning, predatory, they're capable of disguising themselves as humans. The reader's also given anecdotes, and these warnings set the tone for the tale of a young girl venturing into the forest that forms that central plot. The central narrative follows a brave, inexperienced girl who sets out to visit her grandmother, carrying food through the snowy woods. She encounters a handsome young huntsman who offers to race her to her grandmother's house, and he proposes a wager. If he arrives first, he'll claim a kiss from her, which she accepts. However, the huntsman knows the forest better than she does and inevitably arrives before her. At the grandmother's house, he reveals his true nature. He is a wolf, essentially a werewolf. He kills and devours the old woman before disguising himself in her clothes. And when the girl arrives, she initially follows the familiar fairy tale pattern, questioning the wolf about his large eyes, ears, his teeth. But instead of being devoured, she responds with courage and curiosity. She laughs in the face of danger. She actually undresses herself and chooses to seduce the wolf. So the story doesn't end with her destruction or with her being rescued by somebody as the traditional fairy tale goes, but it ends with a somewhat unsettling essential union in which she tames the beast and embraces her own sexual awakening. In terms of the context, we're not going to go into too much detail because I've already provided some context for the entire collection in the first video where I looked at the Bloody Chamber. So I'm just giving you a brief overview now. As I mentioned in that video, when the book was published in 1979, it was at the height of second wave feminism. And so a lot of the themes and messages in The Company of Wolves we look at through a feminist lens. In terms of the literary context, The Company of Wolves is a dark Gothic reimagining of Little Red Riding Hood, or Little Red Cap as it's called in the Grimm's fairy tale version. It blends folklore, fairy tale, and horror. Out of all of the stories in Carter's collection, this one follows the original fairy tale fairly closely, at least the central plot of it does. It's only when we get to the end of the story that we see a radical change in direction. Of course, the story also has that long, drawn-out exposition before the central plot begins. Exposition is the introduction that provides background information and context. In The Company of Wolves, it opens with wolf lore and superstition that is sort of a prelude to the main plot. And you'll hopefully have noticed that the writing style is a bit different to her other tales. That's because the tone and style of this introduction mimics oral storytelling traditions, using old wives' tales and communal warnings passed down through generations. Like many stories in this collection, it also draws on Gothic literature by using traditional Gothic tropes like the uncanny, transformation, liminality, and threshold. And we'll look a bit more closely at these when we look at imagery. So the story is a third-person narration. The main character in the central plot is a girl who's unnamed. A lot of critics just refer to her as Red. She is brave and curious and independent. We're told she is the strong-minded child. When we first introduced her, she's described as young and inexperienced. She is the youngest child who is indulged by her mother and her grandmother, which implies that she's a bit spoiled. But perhaps that indulgence is what made her so confident in herself. She's fearless enough to enter the forest alone, even though we're told it's the worst time of year for the wolves. In terms of her physical appearance, we're told she is pretty, and her hair is like lint, so fair it hardly makes a shadow on her pale forehead. She has pale skin and red cheeks, which is a classic fairy tale description of beauty and innocence. She wears a red shawl that has the ominous, if brilliant, look of blood on snow. We'll dig deeper into this when we look at symbolism, but it's interesting that Carter links her shawl to blood because in the very next sentence, she talks about her transition into womanhood, saying her breasts have just begun to swell, and goes on to explain she has just started her woman's bleeding. This is an example of liminality in the story, where she's not a child, but not yet an adult either. She's in this in-between space of adolescence. At the end of the story, when she rejects the idea that she must be scared of the wolves or men, what she's doing is she is embracing her own power for the huntsman or the wolf. We see an interesting subversion of the original fairy tale in the character of the huntsman. Unlike the original fairy tale, where the huntsman is the one who rescues her from the wolf, Carter has combined the hunter and the wolf characters. Now we know from the beginning, from that long introduction to the story, that these wolves, who are essentially werewolves, are dangerous and cunning. In fact, the opening paragraph of the story says they are cunning and ferocious. And a bit further down, it describes them as forest assassins. This hunter wolf is a trickster figure. He's charming and seductive. He is a predator. However, Carter complicates things because he's not just a monster. He's also physically attractive and human-like. One of the first things the girl notices when he suddenly comes out of the woods and onto the path is what a fine fellow he is. He's also described as dashing and handsome gentleman. In fact, she finds him so attractive that when he makes a bet with her about who can reach the grandmother's house first, she purposefully takes her time. She wants to lose the bet because that way she'll get to kiss him. To add to this layered portrayal of the wolf's character, the wolf's howling is described as a threnody. Now, threnody is another word for a lament or a sad song, which makes him seem mournful rather than purely violent. Carter does a great job of creating characters like this in her story who are not black and white characters who are all good or all evil. We see the same thing in The Lady of the House of Love. This is a departure from classic fairy tales with a straightforward good and evil message. Instead, in many of Carter's stories, we have this gray area that makes this kind of black and white categorization impossible. In this story, in spite of all the warnings that we get about the wolves at the beginning, we come to understand that there's more to them than meets the eye. He and the other werewolves are complex characters. And by the end, he's called Tender. The girl sleeps safely in his arms. That positioning of her within the cocoon of his arms conveys a protectiveness in him that seems entirely at odds with the ferocious beast described in the folklore type of introduction. And this shift in characterization changes him from a figure of fear into one of intimacy, which is in effect blurring the lines between desire and danger. The hunter wolf represents both the threat of violence and the possibility of transformation through acceptance. There are many themes I could talk about, but we're going to keep it focused on three main themes for this video, and that is primal nature, female sexuality and empowerment, and transformation and liminality. So primal nature refers to the animal within. The wolf symbolizes that untamed, instinctual side of human nature, especially in relation to desire and sexuality. They're referred to as carnivore incarnate, in other words, meat-eater made flesh. They're the embodiment of raw, animalistic, instinctual carnal desire. But in a classic subversive twist from Carter, she doesn't demonize this wildness. In fact, the way she's written about it actually invites the reader to see it as something to be acknowledged and embraced. And we see that in the girl's character. There's something instinctual in her that is drawn to the werewolf. And when she's forced to confront her fears, she makes the choice to embrace that instinctual side of her nature. Carter subverts the traditional moral of Little Red Cap, which is essentially a story about female obedience and the danger of straying from the path. In other words, denying one's curiosity or instinct. Even in the introduction of this story, where it's talking about the various wolf lore, on page 130 it says, "For if you stray from the path for even one instant, the wolves will eat you." But the subversive actions of the girl suggest the complete opposite of that denying one's instincts, especially as a woman, can be more dangerous than actually embracing them. The wolf may be a threat, but he is also a mirror of the girl's own evolving instincts and desires. And when she embraces that carnal part of her nature, she becomes the aggressor. She's the one seducing him, which takes us to the next theme, which is very closely linked to primal nature, and that is female sexuality and empowerment. One of the central themes is the girl's sexual awakening and that embrace of her own desire, or that embrace of primal nature. Unlike traditional versions of Little Red Riding Hood, where the girl remains naive and passive, Carter's heroine chooses to confront and seduce the wolf. She's reversing that predator-prey dynamic. there's a specific moment that we see this transformation happen. It's a narrative turning point, almost like a volta in a poem. And that's where she says, since her fear did her no good, she ceased to be afraid. It's a lovely example of female agency because the heroine makes a conscious choice not to be afraid, and then she begins what can only be described as a striptease until she's completely naked. Threaded through this part of the scene is the intertextuality of those traditional Little Red Riding Hood lines, what big arms you have, what big teeth you have. And when the wolf says, all the better to eat you with, this is the heroine's reaction. The girl burst out laughing. She knew she was nobody's meat. She laughed at him full in the face. And then she goes on to rip off his shirt. So Carter challenges the idea that female sexuality is something dangerous or shameful. Instead, she portrays it as a source of power. Now, it's important to note here that there are some critics who argue that this is not really female agency, where when her actions are viewed in the context of the wolf's threat. Is she doing it because she's embracing her desires, or just because she's trying to save herself from a worse fate? Because she's been backed into a corner with no other options. And different scholars have different opinions about this, and I have to say I don't personally agree with that viewpoint, because for me it's clear from the moment she meets the huntsman that there is this immediate attraction. She specifically tries to lose the bet so she can kiss him. So the seduction didn't come out of nowhere. That's just my reading of it. But whether you see her seduction as a moment of female agency or not, at the end of the day, she's still embracing her sexuality in a way that is very empowering and a subversion of normal power dynamics in a relationship, where the man is the seducer. Here, the prey becomes the predator. The last theme is a lovely Gothic one, and that is transformation and liminality. Just to refresh your memory, liminality refers to that in-between state. It's occupying a threshold or a boundary that destabilizes clear categories. We can't talk about liminality in the story without talking about transformation, because they are so intertwined. This story constantly explores transformation, whether it's literal transformation of man into wolf, or a metaphorical transformation of a young girl into a young woman, as those physical changes are happening in her body, or even psychological transformation from a passive, fearful victim into an active heroine who takes control of her own destiny. The forest functions as a liminal space. It is quite a common liminal trope in Gothic literature, because it stands between the civilized world of the village or home and the wildness of nature. It's a place where boundaries blur, and we see that even in her first encounter with the wolf in the forest. She's aware that the forest is a dangerous place, and when she hears this rustling noise, she grabs the handle of her knife. But when he actually appears on the path, we see this blurring of fear and desire. The huntsman or werewolf is the embodiment of liminality, because he is not fully beast and not fully man. Similar to vampires and zombies, he exists in this in-between state. The heroine is also in a liminal space, because as an adolescent, she's suspended between childhood or innocence and womanhood or sexual knowledge. I don't usually like to share super long quotes on slides like this, but for the theme of liminality, I thought it was important, because the liminality of the wolves is not just about their physical transformation. This is a quote from the long introduction talking about the werewolf lore and superstition. And it says, that long-drawn, wavering howl has, for all its fearful resonance, some inherent sadness in it, as if the beasts would love to be less beastly if only they knew how, and never cease to mourn their own condition. There is a vast melancholy in the canticles of the wolves, melancholy infinite as the forest, endless as these long nights of the winter, and yet that ghastly sadness, that mourning for their own irremediable appetites, can never move the heart, for not one phrase in it hints at the possibility of redemption. In the traditional fairy tale, the wolf is a clear symbol of evil and deception. It reinforces the binaries of good and evil. But in a classic subversive style, in this passage, Carter presents the wolves not as purely evil monsters, as they have kind of been described up until this point, but as complex, self-aware beings. That sadness and melancholy they feel tell us that they're tragically conscious of their condition. They're aware that they're monsters, but they desire to be something different. They desire to be less beastly. That melancholy and mourning for their own irremediable appetites, irremediable is incurable. It evokes sympathy rather than fear. And that imagery undermines the binaries of good and evil. By presenting them this way, Carter's inviting empathy and reflection rather than moral judgment against these creatures who are caught in this monstrous liminal space that they don't actually want to be in. We'll look at thresholds and liminality a little bit closer when we look at the Gothic imagery in the story. I'm going to end off by doing a close reading of some of the imagery in the story. As with the other stories in this collection, she's got some lovely Gothic imagery, especially in her descriptions of things that are uncanny. Unsettling images, like on page 129, where the narrator starts out describing the eyes as red, which is the color of danger, but then tells us, if a wolf's eyes reflect only moonlight, then they gleam a cold and unnatural green, a mineral, a piercing color. She goes on to describe them as luminous, terrible sequins stitched suddenly on the black thickets. In Gothic literature, the uncanny refers to a disturbing feeling caused by something that's both familiar and foreign at the same time. It blurs the lines between the real and the supernatural, or the rational and the irrational. It creates the sense of unease and psychological terror that stems from the concept of the familiar made strange. In other words, it's a psychological experience of encountering something that is simultaneously strange and yet disturbingly familiar. Here, we see that in the wolf, a familiar beast, and yet with eyes that change from red to this unnatural mineral green. The words luminous and sequins suggest something shiny or glowing, and that ties in with the girl noting that the hunter's eyes were diabolic phosphorescence. When the narrator describes the folklore and superstition around werewolves and how they change from man to beast, it says, yet by the eyes, those phosphorescent eyes, you know him in all his shapes, the eyes alone unchanged by metamorphosis. So the werewolf shifts between human and beast, the ultimate transformation, yet the eyes remain the same. This means that even when the figure appears to be a normal man, something familiar, the eyes retain the horrifying, unnatural glow of the beast, the unfamiliar. It's a window into this savage monster that's lurking beneath the skin of civility. We get more of the uncanny when the narrator tells us they will be like shadows, they will be like wraiths, grey members of a congregation of nightmare. Those words, shadow and wraiths, suggest something supernatural, something existing on the boundary between living and dead. Wraiths are traditionally vengeful spirits. These are not friendly ghosts she's talking about. She's talking about supernatural entities that are out for vengeance. And by doing this, she's linking the wolves directly to the realm of the supernatural and to the horror of the return of the dead. It's also important to point out here that the color grey is deliberately chosen to reinforce this theme of liminality, of being in between. It's the color of transition. It's neither black nor white. This suggests that these beings are ambiguous. They're not fully part of the known, ordered world. To continue along the line of supernatural imagery, I want to end off by looking at Carter's lovely imagery of the solstice. In that extensive introduction, the narrator tells a story of a man who disappeared on his wedding night after he went outside to relieve himself. His bride eventually moves on and remarries and has 2 children with her new husband. And then we get this fabulous line. Until one freezing night, the night of the solstice, the hinge of the year when things do not fit together as well as they should, the longest night, her first good man came home again. This quote is a perfect example of why I love Angela Carter's prose so much. It's a masterful condensation of liminality, Gothic horror, and the uncanny all in a single sentence. It's brilliant. The fact that her husband, who she believes to be dead, suddenly appears is uncanny in itself. But I want to look much more closely at this sentence. First, the phrase, things do not fit together as well as they should, suggests that the natural order itself falters at this darkest point of the year. Nature is usually a place of fixed laws. There's predictable continuity in nature. The solstice is when that fit loosens, allowing for the intrusion of the disruptive, the unexpected, the supernatural. In pagan and folkloric traditions, the winter solstice is a very important time of year. The extreme length of the night is thought to bring the spirit world closer. It's believed to be a time when ghosts and spirits and other malign entities are most powerful and able to walk the earth. The veil between the natural and the supernatural is thin, which brings us to the fabulous metaphor of the solstice as the hinge of the year. Where do we find hinges? We find them on doors. A hinge is a mechanism that connects two fixed points, but in a way that allows for movement between them. So the door is able to open and close. And this metaphor perfectly captures the idea of a temporary joint in time that allows the dead or the undead to cross back. It creates this lovely Gothic threshold imagery that connects the world of the living, the ordered world of that we live in, to the world of the dead or chaos. That lovely Gothic imagery is repeated again when the central plot begins and the heroine sets off on a journey to visit her grandmother. We're told it is Christmas Eve. The malign door of the solstice still swings upon its hinges. Here, she not only specifically references it as a door, in other words, a threshold, but she tells us it's malign. In other words, it's hostile or it's evil, it's swinging. And that means that on this night of all nights, there's an opening for the supernatural. And the third time Carter uses this metaphor is in the closing lines of the story. Midnight, and the clock strikes. It is Christmas Day, the werewolf's birthday, and the door of the solstice stands wide open. Let them all sink through. We have more liminal imagery in the word midnight. Midnight is the precise threshold between 2 days. It's also traditionally the witching hour, time for supernatural activity. The clock striking emphasizes the completion of that transition, the absolute finality of the day's end and a new day beginning. What's different about this imagery this time is that the door isn't just swinging on its hinges, it's wide open. The door is no longer a protective barrier to keep out the wolves, like we're told in the introduction, where it talks about the wives closing the doors to the kitchens so the wolves can't come in. The supernatural is no longer just knocking, it's fully invaded. But one of the most important aspects of this is actually perhaps the innocuous looking reference to Christmas Day. Here, we have the most profound collision of two worlds. Christmas Day is one of the most sacred days in the Christian calendar because it celebrates the birth of Christ, who is purity and redemption in human form. And in typical subversive form, by immediately declaring it the werewolf's birthday, Carter contaminates the sacred with the monstrous. The sentence ends with, "Let them sink through," an imperative statement that signifies the heroine's total rejection of the old fear-based narrative. The them refers not just to the werewolves, but to all the dark, chaotic, repressive elements that the night and the solstice represent. It's not a line of fear, but of acceptance. It's a very powerful imagery to end the story with, because instead of being terrified, the girl, who's now lying in the arms of the wolf, has embraced her own wild nature. She herself has crossed the threshold of the door of the solstice and is now ushering the remaining monsters into her new reality. I hope this video has been helpful in your understanding of the layered meaning of the story. If you want to see when I upload the next one, please subscribe, and you are welcome to leave your thoughts or questions in the comments. And if you have any suggestions of books that you want to cover, I would be happy to oblige.